Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. I've said it before and I'll say it again. In my opinion, Gran Turismo does original circuits better than just about anyone. Yes, the team at Polyphony Digital really seem to have a knack for creating their own courses, a tradition that's been part of the series since the very beginning. But today, it's time to put these tracks against each other as I attempt to rank every single one of them. But before we dive in, let's set some ground rules. Firstly, what is an original circuit? An original circuit is a fictional track that's been created for the game. Some have never been linked to any particular part of the world, for example, Midfield Raceway, but others are given an explicit location. Take Eiger Nordwand. Either way, as long as they don't actually exist as racetracks in real life, they're all original circuits just the same. In most of these games, original tarmac circuits are clearly labelled as such. However, they aren't the only ones we'll be ranking today. The unique dirt and snow courses will also be included. And then we need to consider street tracks. GT has featured plenty of these over the years, like the fictional special stage routes, but there have also been street circuits based on real locations and real roads. I'm going to include these as well, but only on the basis that despite the places and roads being real, they aren't actually used as circuits in real life, with the layout instead being drawn up by Polyphony. So something like Seattle Circuit will count, but Côte d'Azur, which is simply just a facsimile of the real Monte Carlo street circuits, will not. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to rank each circuit location with their different variations considered all together. So when I rank Grand Valley, that will include both the main Grand Valley Speedway, as well as Grand Valley East, and the reverse variations of each. However, this won't count for circuits that are based in the same location, but not connected in any way. So for example, Dragon Trail Seaside and Dragon Trail Gardens will be ranked separately. There will also be a handful of exceptions to this. El Capitan and Cathedral Rocks are linked and do share a section of track. However, as El Capitan is purely a road circuit, and Cathedral Rocks is mostly gravel, they serve two distinct purposes, and so I'll rank them individually. The same is true for Rome circuits. The version in GT5 and 6 does use the same road around the Colosseum as the version in GT2 and 3, but as the former is a replacement for the latter, I consider them as distinct. Oh, and also I'm only including full circuits that actually appear in the final game. None of the license test specific tracks, nor courses that were cut or went unused in the final game will be included. And the final thing to say is that this is my list. It's not a ranking based on the general opinions of these tracks, but purely what I think based on my own experiences. But to give you an insight, the sorts of things I'll be considering is how enjoyable these circuits are to drive, how good they are for racing with other cars, and also what makes them unique and memorable. Well, we've got a lot of tracks to get through, so let's not waste any more time. This is every original circuit in Gran Turismo ranked. Let's do this. And right off the bat, I'm already sort of breaking my own rules, as Grand Canyon Short only appears in one driving school test in GT4 Prologue. But hey, something has to be last, and I don't think too many people will object to it being this. It also means that we can achieve a nice round number of 75 tracks. Anyway, Grand Canyon Short exists alongside the main Grand Canyon course, so it does at least have an interesting setting. Its layout is simple but effective as an introduction to dirt driving, which is its entire purpose. It's quite short and narrow, so it wouldn't be very good to race on, but given that isn't even possible to do, it's a moot point. The token beginner course of GT4 is called Beginner Course. If this list were based purely on track names, its ranking wouldn't be much different. Part of the driving park complex, this track does feel quite well realised in terms of how it's nestled into the area, with the Gymkhana course even appearing as part of the scenery. Its layout takes the form of an uneven oval, with the first corner being much tighter than the final one. There's also a small chicane that interrupts the back straight, which does add a fractional amount of challenge to the course. But for the most part, it just does what it says on the tin. The original test course from Gran Turismo's 1 and 2 is up next. This high-speed oval, based on the former real-life Yatabe test track, was the place to push your cars to their very limits in the machine test. Beyond that, it didn't really have much purpose in the game, but it did at least give you somewhere to try out the HKS drag cars in GT2. Visually, there's not a lot going on, and the layout is pretty standard, a staple of Gran Turismo, but nothing more. But wait, there's another one. Test Course reappeared in GT3, but was updated so much to the point where it no longer resembles the original track in any way. It's almost doubled in length and is also much wider. In terms of scenery, there's still not a lot to see, but the constant tree line has been replaced by wide open plains. There is also a tunnel and some wind turbines, which is something, I guess. This track is probably best remembered for the Like the Wind event, a high-speed slipstream battle with some of the fastest cars in the game. Ultimately, it's this usage that really puts this version of the track above its PS1 predecessor, in my opinion. Good old pod race. This really is the definition of a novelty circuit, as it makes use of a small section of the front straight and pit lane on Special Stage Route 5. It's basically a simple loop with a hairpin at each end. There are a couple of basic chicanes inserted, but the real star of the show is the jump just before the start-finish line. Or at least it would be a jump if the game didn't force you to stop just before it. Yeah, there's a reason why people remember the Toyota Pod, the only car you can drive the circuit with, far better than Pod Race itself. Finally we come to our first proper track, and it's a snow course of all things. Ice Arena is a narrow circuit reminiscent of those used in ice racing like the Andros Trophy. I don't really like it, and that's partly not even its fault. I just don't think that GT4's twitchy, low-speed handling model on dirt and snow is really suited to this type of track. The special conditions events that take place on it are some of the most infuriating in all of Gran Turismo. And that's not just thanks to the handling, but also GT4's abysmal penalty system. This track does represent something unique in Gran Turismo, and in another game it could have actually been pretty cool, but I can only judge it based on my experience with it. And needless to say, I've never enjoyed it. Well, back to the ovals, here's Northern Isle Speedway. This track was first seen in GT Sport, and once again represents something unique in the series, as a short, banked oval had never been seen in these games before. And with a unique style of track comes a unique style of racing. It's just a shame that Gran Turismo doesn't feature NASCAR anymore, which kind of limits its usability. I think the overall visual design of the course is pretty impressive. They really nailed the atmosphere. The main reason it's ranked so low is because it's very similar to the real-life Bristol Motor Speedway, so it doesn't gain much when it comes to originality. Even still, I do appreciate them using its infield to create some basic layouts for a handful of missions in GT Sport. And at the end of the day, at least it manages to achieve the coveted 69th place. Once again, should this track really be on the list? Maybe. Maybe not. Appearing in just GT2, Motorsports Land is only accessible from time trial in arcade mode. Given its tight and twisty nature, that's not too surprising. It's pretty much a kart track. It's just a shame that GT2 doesn't have any karts. But for what it is, I have to say it's quite well designed. I especially like the ending section with the main building and timing tower. It would have been really cool if they brought it back for GT5 when karts actually made an appearance. Without them, this track really is just another novelty. The layout of Super Speedway is directly based on the Motegi Oval that would effectively replace it from GT4 onwards. However, unlike Northern Isle Speedway, GT's version is visually quite different from the real thing. In my opinion, it's actually a lot more interesting, especially the GT3 version. Just a shame they removed the canopy from the final corner that was in GT2 and even early builds of GT3. Really, this track is about as good as you could expect it to be. It's a medium-sized oval, nowhere near as large as the test course, but still much bigger than something like Northern Isle. But speaking of big ovals, they don't get much bigger than Special Stage Route X. In fact, this is the single longest track in Gran Turismo history. This oval was effectively a replacement for the test course when it first arrived as DLC in GT5. Thankfully, this time round, they actually made it visually interesting, featuring a port with ships going in and out, an airfield with various planes, and a bunch of other cool details. On the front straight, there's a long incline followed by a decline that helps with top speed runs, and 2 massive banked corners at either end. Random fact, this was the only returning original circuit in GT Sports. Yep, Special Stage Route X really is the ultimate top speed oval. It's just a shame that they broke the unwritten rule by making it run clockwise. Here's Blue Moon Bay Speedway, yet another style of oval. This one is triangular, very loosely based on the real-life Pocono Raceway. Out of all of the ovals, this one is probably the most visually appealing, but it's also the only one to feature a full infield layout. Personally, I'm not a massive fan of the infield versions. I've always hated the first corner and the way you come off the banking at a stupid angle, and I find the layouts themselves pretty uninspired. Infield B is practically still an oval, it's ridiculous. As for the full speedway, I actually find it more interesting, since all 3 of its corners are unique. I definitely have some good memories of sport mode races around here. London is the first of the many original street circuits based on real roads to appear on this list. Honestly, for as much potential as this circuit has, I've always found it really disappointing. It's just way too short and narrow to use for much more than racing lower end cars. It doesn't even have a pit lane, so it's out of the question when it comes to longer races as well. I've also never been a big fan of the location. Yes, it does take in some landmarks like Piccadilly Circus and Trafalgar Square, but does it bother anyone else how you spend almost all of your time between buildings that block out so much of the light? It makes the track feel more claustrophobic than it is. It's a real shame that we never got the longer version of this track that was planned for GT5, because I feel like it could have been much better. Here's another unique idea for an original circuit, one set entirely within a stadium. Gran Turismo Arena is another track that's best suited for kart racing, but it can be driven with other vehicles as well. As for its layout, it vaguely resembles the Gran Turismo logo, which is a nice touch. Sadly, that doesn't make it all too engaging to drive. It's quite telling that this track is used for coffee break challenges much more often than it's used for actual races in GT6. Although they were quite limited with the space they had to work with, the handful of cut versions of this track that we know about, like the stunt track and the version with an elevated crossover, show that it would have been possible to do more. It's just a shame that they never did. Broadbean Raceway is up next. This is the highest ranked oval on my list, and that's mostly thanks to how unique it is. Firstly, it's an oval that goes left and right, something that you're not going to see too often. And as a shorter oval, I just really enjoy the layout. In some ways, it kind of drives like a fast and open road circuit. Not to mention that it has its own theming, with black and green being splashed everywhere. Visually, I find it quite memorable. The real shame is just how underused it is. In GT7, it features in just a single race event, and it's the Sunday Cup. It kinda feels like Polyphony designed it and then didn't really know what to use it for. Man, what a waste. GT2 was the first Gran Turismo to feature rally as a discipline, and with tracks like Smoky Mountain South, it kinda shows. A sort of featureless nothing of a track that still manages to be decent with some faster corners and jumps, but ultimately, it just isn't very memorable. In terms of scenery, there basically isn't any, as the continuous tree line obscures anything that may be beyond the course. Of the 2 Smoky Mountain tracks in GT2, this one gets left in the dust. Just a side note, I am ranking Swiss Alps from GT3 and 4 separately, even though it is technically a heavily updated version of Smoky Mountain South. I'll explain that more when we get round to ranking it. Green Forest Roadway has to be one of the most forgotten circuits in the entire franchise. For one, its name is very similar to Deep Forest Raceway, a track that has a much bigger legacy. And also, its layout is quite similar to the aforementioned Smoky Mountain South. In essence, this track really is just a better version of it, hence it being placed one spot higher. Not only is the layout marginally better with more corner variety, but it's also much more interesting visually. It has tunnels, bridges, grandstands, bigger jumps, and even exposed rock faces like Trial Mountain. There are only 2 dirt tracks in GT2 that never return to the series in any form. The first one is this, and the other is Pikes Peak. Yeah, this track was never destined to be well remembered. I'll be honest, snow tracks aren't really my thing. I just don't find them to be all that fun in most racing games. Maybe this is why I've ranked Chamonix from GT5 and 6 where I have. On paper, the layout is fine. It has its highlights, like the downhill section before the fast right-hander, and on the visual side it looks decent. I just really struggle to find anything interesting to say about it, good or bad. Maybe this is because it has the distinction of being one of the very few tracks to not be used in any career mode race events in GT5 or GT6. Yes, really. Not even the developers of the game seem to care all that much about it. And here's another Chamonix. This is the original version of the track seen only in GT4. Now, you could make a similar comparison with Ice Arena. It's a narrow snow course where it's difficult to overtake, and you have to deal with GT4's stupid-ass penalty system. And I think that would be fair to say, but the difference is that I actually like the layout of this track. It really feels like a genuine rally stage. Also, you do have the much wider tarmac section that offers some respite and an easier place to make an overtake. Really, ranking this track above its PS3 counterpart comes down to two factors. One, I prefer the layouts, both visually and to drive, and two, I don't frequently forget that this track even exists. Now we have the first of the quote-unquote tarmac rally circuits. George V Paris is a very tight and twisty track set in the French capital. Its layout is pretty much the opposite of flow. It starts with an almost full 360-degree circle around the Arc de Triomphe, and then breaks off into a series of sharp angular corners among the narrow side streets. Needless to say, it isn't great for racing, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I enjoy its nighttime setting. It really adds a lot to the circuit, and also helps make it more visually distinct from Opera Paris, which is just down the road. Ultimately, that can't save its awkward layouts, but it's still a track that I appreciate in some ways. Following on from London, here's Chapter 2 of street circuits that could have been better, but weren't. Okay, that's not quite fair. One major strength of Seoul Central is that its fast and simple layout makes for great racing. It also has a pit lane. But for me, that's kind of where the positives end. I just don't find the layout all that fun or memorable. Again, maybe the exact location just wasn't right. When you have a city as vast and sprawling as Seoul, you expect a bit more than a simple layout with 5 corners that spans just over a mile and a half. Not one of GT4's better circuits, but it does at least have an uncanny resemblance to the Norrisring street circuit in Germany. So that's something. Tahiti Road is the token beginner course of GT2, and I have to say that, for what it is, it's pretty damn good. As opposed to most beginner tracks we've seen that are short and low speed, Tahiti Road is very fast and flowing. It's great, still easy to learn and drive with slower cars, but it's also quite fun with the faster stuff. Also, I find the island setting of Tahiti to be a really cool one. It definitely stands out compared to most other tracks in this game. Sadly, the visuals of GT2 can't really do it justice, so it's a shame that it never returned in the series, as I love to imagine what a version of this track would look like in current day. Colorado Springs is quite a tricky dirt course. You're pretty much always cornering, there isn't much chance to breathe. As such, it acts as a pretty effective test for your skill on gravel. On the visual side, there isn't too much going on. There is the lake, that also features in the official name of the track, but that's about it. It's certainly the weakest of the dirt courses introduced in GT Sports when it comes to how memorable it is, but I think the layout is pretty solid. There's a lot to catch you out, like abrupt elevation changes in awkward places, and also the track narrowing suddenly in the final sector. Nailing a lap around here does feel good. What happened to Tahiti Dirt Routes 1 and 2? I have no clue, but third time's the charm, I guess. Tahiti Dirt Route 3, or Tahiti Circuit as it's known in GT3, is a strange one. It's sort of like the middle child in between Tahiti Road and Tahiti Maze. I mean, they couldn't even be bothered to give it a proper name. As such, it kind of goes under the radar for a lot of people. The usual Tahiti island setting is nice, and the layout is decent. The most memorable part being the back straight, which isn't straight, where there are some big jumps. In the reverse layouts, they're even wilder. But the fact that nobody really ever talks about how this was one of the few circuits cut between GT3 and GT4 for absolutely no reason, kind of says it all. I remember Toscana being used quite a lot in the marketing for GT5. Clearly Polyphony were proud of it, but when it came to the game itself, it just never really clicked. Naturally, part of this will be down to how dirt and snow courses were barely used in the PS3 era, thus putting them at a natural disadvantage compared to the rally tracks that came before. For what it's worth, I do enjoy the layouts, particularly the first and last sectors, but I rarely ever find myself wanting to drive this circuit on my own volition. People who play GT5 will remember that Toscana was also a coursemaker theme, albeit on tarmac, and I think that really highlights the problem. If this track were paved with tarmac, it honestly wouldn't look all that different from a coursemaker circuit. In a word, it feels generic. And here is the newest original circuit in the series as of this video. Lake Louise is a snow course, and actually the highest ranked one on my list. I think that with this track they struck a solid balance between making it good for racing, while still having a layout that's interesting to drive as it is. As you expect from GT7, it also looks stunning, particularly at night, and features a few different variations. I think the idea to make a snow oval, or a snowval if you will, is pretty funny, and I applaud them for that. Realistically, this track was never going to be used a great deal, but as the only snow course currently in the series, I think they did a solid job. Sardinia Windmills has kind of become the go-to rally track in current Gran Turismo. Even still, it's anything but simple. Featuring a variety of low, medium, and high-speed corners, this track is notorious for its jumps and crests. The key is in how you line up your car for them so that you can land neatly and not lose too much speed. The setting is cool, even if it does contradict the name of the track. There are certainly wind turbines, yet no windmills. But pedantry aside, I think this is a pretty solid dirt track, and one that I enjoy driving every time I get the chance to. Kart Space is the first, and so far only, indoor circuit in Gran Turismo. From a setting and theme perspective, this track knocks it out of the park. I really don't know how they could have done an indoor karting circuit better than this. The ultimate compliment I can give is that Kart Space is a place that I would want to go to in real life. If it actually existed, of course. In terms of layout, it has the same situation as GT Arena in being severely limited when it comes to space. Despite that, I think they did a decent job. Naturally, the circuit is on the slower side, but they do cram in a fair amount into the area they have. I particularly like the long left-hander in the middle of the track for the variety it brings, and also as a driving challenge. They may be separated by just one ranking, but I don't think you can make a bigger jump than going from Kart Space to Special Stage Route 7. This track is modelled after the Tokyo to Yokohama Expressway and effectively served as the token top speed track in GT5, before Route X came along. This track has become something of a cult classic thanks to it being used very often in online lobbies for cruising, drag racing, car shows, and even more. But when looking past all of that, I don't think their execution of this idea was the best. The track is visually pretty monotonous, which some would argue is just authentic, but I still think that a lot more could have been done. An even bigger issue is just how unfinished it looks in places, particularly around the top end loop. It kind of feels like they got 80% of the way done with it and then just gave up. But hey, at least you can live out your Wangan midnight fantasies, and to some, that's all that really matters. The best of the current GT original rally circuits, in my opinion, is Fisherman's Ranch. This track kind of has a bit of everything. High speed, low speed, and plenty of jumps and bumps. Its setting is also somewhat unique for a dirt course in this series. It kind of feels like a slice of the Baja 1000. Much more rally raid than simply rally. My only major critique is that, partially because of this, it doesn't feel as tightly designed as some of the rally tracks in the older games. The final section is pretty good, but the rest of the layout kind of feels like it was scribbled down in a matter of seconds. There are also some parts that feel strangely wide, but that does at least allow for some interesting racing lines. I'm willing to bet that most people wouldn't rank Hong Kong this high, but I kinda like this track. Right off the bat, it gets points for its setting. The late evening aesthetic is really nice. There's also a bit of variety as you start off driving along the waterfront before heading deeper into the urban sprawl with its various illuminations. As for the layouts, yeah, it's not amazing. But unlike London and Seoul, I do get the impression that they really tried to make it as interesting as they could. It's just that a track set in the heart of a city as compact as Hong Kong was always going to result in a narrow and awkward layout. yet. Even still, I do appreciate how they managed to pack all of it in, like with the crossover and also the location of the pit lane. New York is unusual for a street circuit in the sense that it's quite fast thanks to its long straights. But yet again, it's another street circuit where I've never been entirely satisfied with the layout they chose. It's kind of like Seoul Plus. I think the section running from Central Park down Broadway is solid, but the other half, with a bunch of right-angle turns, feels unnecessary and like they were just padding the length of the track. Even still, it's a solid circuit, and one that's very much tied to GT4 as a game, thanks to being one of the first circuits that was revealed, and thus appearing in a lot of the marketing. But when it comes to New York and racing games, I'll just say that, for me, Forza did it better. We're on a roll when it comes to GT4 exclusive street circuits, so why stop now? The sister circuit to George V Paris is Opera Paris, and this time it is considered a full circuit and not just a special conditions one. Even still, it is also quite narrow and sinuous. Another feature of this track is the bumps that can easily unsettle your car if you hit them in the wrong way. This circuit is not exactly beginner friendly, but once you learn its various tricks, I think it's pretty fun. There's also the nice touch that it winds around the Place de la Concorde, which is the headquarters of the FIA, the governing body that sanctions many of the major car racing championships all over the world. Ah, I bet you forgot about this one, didn't you? Motorland is definitely up there when it comes to forgotten original circuits in these games. Part of the driving park, this is a pretty small circuit that's best suited to slower cars. Of course, this does severely limit its usability, but all things considered, in spite of that, I think it's a good track with a fun layout. And in reverse, it gets even better. It has that same driving park charm as the beginner course, even if the visuals are nothing special. For the size of circuit that it is, measuring well under a mile long, realistically I don't think they could have made it much better than it already is. Let's head back to the Italian island of Sardinia. Sardinia Road Track takes the form of 3 different variations. Layouts B and C are standard circuits with some interesting corner types and a decent amount of elevation thrown in. But layout A is quite different, appearing as more of an old school road circuit. I enjoy each of them a fair amount. B and C are great for racing lower power machines, and A is good for the faster stuff. It's also quite fitting for a lot of the classic cars as well. Really, the only reason that this isn't ranked higher is because I just don't find it super memorable, and I almost always pick other tracks to drive on instead. And speaking of which, I feel a pretty similar way with Alsace. On paper, this track is excellent, featuring a fast and flowing layout that offers some really challenging corners, and not to mention that being based in the Alsace region of France, it looks stunning as well. And yet, I'm not really sure. I just don't feel any attachment to it. This is probably the most wishy-washy reason I can give to justify a ranking, but to me it seems about right. This track is objectively good, but I just rarely ever feel in the mood to drive it voluntarily. Beyond the main village circuit, GT7 also added a shorter test course layout, which oddly I find myself driving a lot more often. Maybe that's thanks to its ridiculous roller coaster incline, but who can say for sure? Excluding the test course, Autumn Ring is the first of the OG circuits from GT1 on my list. And that's no shame at all. They absolutely knocked it out of the park when it came to those initial tracks. For me, Autumn Ring has never been one of my favourites. Naturally, its twisty, technical layout scales fairly high on the level of challenge, at least for the full circuits. I never really cared for this track in the PS1 games, but when it reappeared in GT4, I started to enjoy it more. And as the series went on, this trend continued, all the way until its so far final appearance in GT6, where it actually looks stunning. A track that's themed around a particular season that isn't winter is very rare in Gran Turismo. So even though it may be closed for 9 months a year, Autumn Ring is still a good time nonetheless. And here's another classic, High Speed Ring. Easily the most simplistic of the original 7 road circuits, there was a real possibility that this track could have been left in the past. But credit where credit is due, Polyphony have always given it a lot of respect. It was refreshed for GT4, overhauled again for GT5, and then given a third facelift and partial layout redesign in GT7. In my opinion, the best version of it yet. The fact that it is so simplistic means that I really can't justify putting it any higher. But to me, the biggest letdown with this track has nothing to do with it inherently. My issue is with how it seems to be used mostly in early game events with slower cars. Now, this does make sense, given that the track is very basic and quite easy to learn, but in my opinion, it's with the more powerful cars where this track really shines. There's nothing quite like a high-speed slipstream battle at high-speed ring. Like New York, Grand Canyon is another one of those circuits that became quite representative of GT4 as a whole. There's no doubting its visuals. One of the goals of this track was clearly for Polyphony to flex their graphical muscles, and they managed to achieve that with flying colours. The way that spectators jump out to take photos before running back is also a really nice touch that makes the whole track feel alive. As for the layout, it does give off the vibe of a proper narrow rally stage, but this has the side effect of it not being particularly good for racing. And when the main rally game mode in GT4 takes the form of a 1v1 race, that's a bit of a problem. If you don't get ahead right at the start, you're pretty much screwed. The layout toes the line between fun and challenging, and just needlessly fiddly. At number 37, we have Eiger Nordwand, but not the road circuits. This ranking is based on the 3 gravel rally trails labelled G, K, and W. When looking at the main K trail, the first half of the course is defined by its steep elevation changes, with the second half generally being a bit slower and more technical. One thing you can say about this circuit is that it certainly isn't forgettable like the other 2 rally tracks from the PS3 era. Driving up the side of a mountain is something you certainly won't forget. Despite the extreme nature of this course, it's not impossible to have a decent race as it's fairly wide in most places. And that's really what gives it the upper hand over Grand Canyon, which, to be fair, is probably the better designed track. Dragon Trail Gardens is such an enigma for me. I've always felt like Polyphony designed this track by threading together some of the weirdest corner combinations they could think of. From the chicane with curbs that are way too high, but you can still cut over them anyway for some reason, to the gradually opening quadruple apex right-hander, and the final double left-hander which is insanely wide, making it really difficult to find the ideal racing line. This track is just weird, and despite that, or maybe because of it, I find it kind of charming. It is deceptively difficult, but really satisfying to nail down. I'm never bored driving this track, and that's partly because there's no denying that it's pretty jank. Side note, I also think the reverse variation is more enjoyable than driving it forwards. The corners just seem to flow better that way. Of the 3 Tokyo Expressway layouts, for me, the east variant pulls the short straw. I will say that this track, in both the clockwise and anti-clockwise directions, can be a lot of fun to race on. The dynamic between having slipstream battles on the long front straight, to the high-speed precision needed for the sweepers on the other side, is really cool. Ultimately, why this track isn't ranked higher is because it feels a bit gimmicky to me. It's kind of like a shrunk down, more usable version of Special Stage Route 7. I find it pretty dull to drive on my own, especially with anything slower than a Group 3 car. The brief moments when you have to nail the 6th gear corners with full commitment can't outweigh the minute or so you have to spend driving in a straight line. Even still, when this track works, it really works. Gran Turismo did a Madrid street circuit way before Formula 1 had the idea. Introduced in GT5, this circuit is made up of a handful of flat-out sections punctuated by slower corners. It is by nature pretty stop-start, as traditional street circuits tend to be. Like most city tracks in Gran Turismo, it takes place right in the heart of Madrid. The thing I like about this track is how well thought out it is. Most street circuits in Gran Turismo take a fair amount of liberties when it comes to their layouts by putting high-speed corners in places that just wouldn't be possible in real life for safety reasons. I don't feel that with Madrid. It seems like a street track that genuinely could exist. That doesn't make it better than those other street tracks, but it certainly helps it to stand out. I know what you're thinking. How can Swiss Alps be ranked 33rd when Smoky Mountain South, the track it's based on, is down in 61st? Now obviously, the layout underwent a major change between GT2 and GT3, with only a handful of turns even remaining the same. And I have to say that I much prefer the newer layout. not. It's just far more well realised, with more strongly defined corners that still maintain a good flow. The second point is the visual glow-up. Aesthetically, this track is 10 times more interesting than its predecessor ever was. It now has a visual identity beyond just green trees and brown dirt. And this all adds up to a circuit that is far superior, in my opinion. This is why I decided to rank them separately, because my outlook on the two circuits is just so drastically different that it would feel wrong to just roll them into one. Cathedral Rocks is a rally circuit that takes place within the confines of the El Capitan road course. In fact, it even has a tarmac section which uses turns 1, 2, and 3 from El Capitan. But when it comes to the gravel section, this course is fairly narrow. Fast in places, but slow and technical in others, it is a real challenge. Naturally, its setting in the Yosemite National Park only helps its ranking, but its layout also plays a big part. It serves GT4's special conditions events pretty much perfectly. It's not so narrow that it makes it frustrating, but at the same time not so wide that it becomes trivial. Well, other than the short tarmac section. Yes, Cathedral Rocks is a very balanced rally circuit. Our second Tokyo Expressway track is Tokyo Expressway South. Added in an update for GT Sports, this track has many of the hallmarks of the other two versions, particularly when it comes to the fast flowing corners. A lot of commitment is needed to get as close to the walls as you can, and thus carry as much speed as possible. But where it differs is between the clockwise and anti-clockwise layouts. The former has a tricky chicane near the end, which is a bit of a departure for Tokyo Expressway, and the latter has a unique dock loop. This is nice to see, given that for the other two layouts, their clockwise and anti-clockwise versions are much more aligned, so it helps Expressway South to stand out a bit more. But it still can't top Tokyo Expressway Central in my view. This track takes the fast and flowing corners of the other two versions and uses them to create a much more compact layout. You're rarely going straight for long enough to have a moment's break before you have to think about the next corner. It's fair to say that this track is far from the most varied. It has one trick, that being high speed, mostly blind corners, and it uses it over and over again. That said, I still really like it. This is one of the few tracks that's fun to drive in pretty much anything. The drawback is that it's not particularly great for racing. Generally, the only way you can make an overtake is if the driver in front hits the wall, since there aren't really any major braking zones anywhere on this course. When you look past the obvious questions of why does Grand Valley Highway exist and what purpose does it serve, both for new players and long-time fans, you'll realise that this circuit is actually pretty good. And I guess that's not really surprising considering that it is heavily based on the old Grand Valley Speedway. But the biggest drawback of GVH is that it's always going to be compared to the OG, and sadly it's never going to win that battle. Almost every change they made to the layout I find questionable. Firstly, there's how the run from turn 2 down to turn 6 was changed from an incline over the blind crest at turn 4 and then steeply downhill to the hairpin to just uniformly downhill all the way. I find it far less interesting. The same is true with the final sector that's become much narrower. In the context of the location, I think it's quite good, but again, compared to Grand Valley Speedway, it just isn't right. And that's before we even talk about the setting. I really appreciate all of the nice details they put into the scenery, but you really have to wonder why they tried so hard to make it differ from the original. At that point, just design a different track entirely. So to summarise, a good circuit that's been tarnished by Polyphony's bizarre decision making. Tahiti Maze, the clue is in the name. Possibly the most difficult dirt track in the entire series, I've always had a soft spot for it, even when I was a kid continuously failing at the R6 license test in GT3. One of the reasons why this course is so divisive is thanks to its abundance of hairpins. There are 9 in total. They might as well have named it Tahiti Hairpins instead. But from that comes the challenge of this track. It is a real test of precision and concentration. If you can nail a lap here, you've pretty much mastered dirt racing. I will admit that most of the enjoyment of this track comes solely from GT3, where the dirt physics of that game allow you to pull off these super satisfying power slides through the hairpins. In GT4, it just isn't quite the same, but the excellent setting and scenery still come through either way. If we're talking about long and difficult tracks, then there's no way that we could ignore Complex String. At the point when it appeared in GT3, so far its only appearance, it was the longest track in the series. Yes, even longer than the test course. Essentially, instead of making unique license test sections like in GT2, Complex String is several of them threaded together to make one complete circuit. As an idea, and an exercise to cram as much track into a defined space as possible, I think it's brilliant. Again, I do have some license test PTSD from it, this time test IB7, but over time I've come to love it in a sort of estranged way. It's always had this mystique about it. I remember the rumours from back in the day saying that it was supposedly based on some sort of secret real-life test track. And whilst that's most likely all a load of bull, I'd be lying if I said that sort of thing hasn't influenced my opinion on it. It may be a racetrack that isn't much good for racing, but that hasn't stopped it from gaining a legendary reputation. Despite only appearing in one game, and only being used in a few specific ways in said game, Complex String is a track that almost every Gran Turismo fan is keenly aware of, and its legacy will continue to live on for many more years to come. I suppose that the closest thing we have to Complex String in current Gran Turismo is this, Kyoto Driving Park. Even still, that's not really much of a comparison. This circuit is predominantly high speed, focusing on long radius corners. This gives it a very flowing layout where you can carry a lot of speed through each turn. It's a real driver's track where how you use the curbs can make a big difference. Not only is it fun to drive, but it also produces excellent races too, and all in a picturesque setting. The fact that you can combine the Yamagiwa and Miyabi layouts is a great idea, and also means that I don't have to rank them separately. Maybe you could argue that the layout lacks a bit of variety, but if you had to pick one style of corner to use several times across a track, I think they chose well. The original Rome circuit comes next. Of course, being in Rome, Polyphony just had to make the track wind around the Colosseum. There's no way they'd miss out on that opportunity. And for what it's worth, they made a pretty good layout from it, featuring a mixture of high-speed and low-speed corners. This, along with Seattle, was the first real-life street circuit to appear in the franchise, which makes it even more impressive how well designed it is. Naturally, it was then beautified in GT3, but the core layout still stayed the same. This circuit essentially served as a template for the many other real-life street circuits we've seen in the series since then, a true testament to the quality of this track. Is it blasphemous to rank the PS3 era version of Rome Circuit above the OG? Probably. I will admit that there isn't as much corner variety when it comes to the newer Rome circuits, with it mostly being made up of medium speed turns. However, it's the details here that give this track the edge in my view. I think the positioning of the pit straight, now heading directly towards the Colosseum, is a definite improvement. Also, I really enjoy the final half of the track. In particular, the high-speed right-hander when you come off the back straight. I've always much preferred this part of the newer version compared to the final few turns on the original course. This is a track that I've always enjoyed driving, and it almost always seems to provide good racing as well. Simple, but effective. Short and sweet, that's how I would describe the Eiger Nordwand Road Circuit. Originally conceived as like a tarmac rally stage in Gran Turismo HD, it eventually grew into the fully fledged track that we know today. Its mixture of slow speed switchbacks and fast sweepers, paired with dramatic elevation changes, is the key to its recipe. Again, this is another track that I feel can be enjoyed with a wide variety of cars, although for racing, I'd only really recommend ones on the lower end of the power scale. As the defining track of the PS3 era of Gran Turismo, it's no surprise that they went all out on the visuals. The mountains, the town, the rolling hillside, it's all here. Its recent return in GT7 further improves the aesthetics, but it is a shame to see them remove some of its most iconic features, namely the big jump and bizarre pit lane. Still, these changes means that they have improved its usability with faster cars. So, swings and roundabouts, I guess. Before Tokyo Expressway, there was Tokyo Route 246. But unlike Expressway, this one is based on real roads on and around Route 246, where the circuit gets its name from. This location was possibly chosen because it's where Sony's HQ is located, which you can even see at the final corner. So that explains the location, but what about the layouts? honestly, it's pretty good. It's strange, because just from looking at an outline, you wouldn't think that it would be that interesting, but it all sort of works. From the long radius right-hander in the first sector, to the high-speed chicane on the back straights, and the twisting run down towards the final corner, there are so many highlights. Also taking in many of the local sights, this track is a good time whether you're racing intensely or just driving on your own. The second of the true original street tracks is up next, Seattle Circuit. If it weren't for the uphill section at the end of the first sector, I would say that this track is again one that very well could have existed in real life. It just has a very organic design, not like Polyphony were taking any major liberties. And yet despite that, this track is really quite fun to drive. And of all of the US cities to choose to make a street track in, Seattle is such an oddball first choice. For me, it's the track's depiction in GT3 and 4 that truly cemented its legacy. I will forever associate Seattle with gorgeous sunsets because of it. It may not be the absolute best track to drive, but it manages to feel authentic, yet still extremely memorable. But speaking of gorgeous sunsets, they'd made this segue much easier. Starting us off in the top 20 is GT2's Red Rock Valley. This track is a complete outlier when it comes to original circuits in GT. It essentially appears as two overlapping ovals that are linked together to create a bizarre high-speed road course. There really is nothing else like it. Sure, it isn't the most challenging track, and there's little in the way of corner variety, at least for a road course, but there's no denying that Red Rock has bags of charm and is always fun to blast through. It's of course more enjoyable in something with a lot of power, but it always provides fun racing no matter what you drive. This is a track that takes full advantage of the fact that it doesn't have to exist in real life. You know, St. Croix is a location that I never realised how much I enjoyed until I started making this list. I think that's because it just isn't really that fun to drive in a lot of cars. But once you get in something with some real power, and preferably being rear-wheel drive, these tracks really start to come alive. They're mostly high speed, but with some tricky corner combinations. Its wide roads also make for excellent racing. My only major issue is that they do rely on basic right-angle corners a bit too often. Layout A is particularly bad for this. But beyond that, I can't find much else negative to say about it. I think this track probably explains why I don't feel much attachment to Alsace, since if I'm going to drive on a road circuit set in the beautiful French countryside, it's gonna be this one. To be honest, unless we're talking about Group 1 prototypes or faster, I'd probably even choose St. Croix over Le Mans. Grindelwald is a track that is simultaneously quite simple and yet deceptively challenging, and I think it's this combination which has made it endure as a fan favourite even now, a full quarter of a century since its only appearance in the series. I mean, after all, this circuit did kick off Gran Turismo's infatuation with the Alpine region, being the first of a whopping 7 tracks to be based there. Only Polyphony would look at the remote town of Grindelwald and think that it could be turned into a racetrack, and yet it works surprisingly well. They did take some liberties when it came to the layouts, but even still it does feel authentic. There's barely a proper straight anywhere on this course. Just like Tahiti Road, this is one that I would really love to see return, even just to witness how stunning they can make it look with modern visuals. The brilliance of Apricot Hill lies in its corner combinations. This track serves as a perfect introduction to more challenging medium and high-speed corners, while still being easy to understand for newer players. The upshot is that it's a track that can be enjoyed by almost anyone at any time, whether you're just trying to complete your first clean lap, or going for time trial world records. This is why I have such a fondness for it personally, as I remember driving it for the first time in GT3 and going through that learning curve. And by the time that it returned updated in GT6, I was on the other side of the fence as a much more competent driver. I always remember using the S's on the reverse layout to help me get better at blind corners. So for me, this track will always be a part of my journey to becoming a better driver. And so, taking the crown as the best dirt circuit is Smoky Mountain North. I've pretty much always loved this track. In GT3, it was my go-to circuit whenever I wanted to do some rally racing. The layout isn't particularly technical, as it can be taken mostly flat out, but it does have some challenging corners, such as the tricky hairpin left at the bottom of the hill. The section on the far side of the course, with the high-speed turns, is also a lot of fun. This track debuted in GT2, but its depiction in GT3 is what everyone remembers. The obvious change is that the starting straight, which isn't straight, is now paved with tarmac, a change that I do like. But the biggest upgrade it got was aesthetically. This track looks stunning, from the time of day to its general setting. I love how they have the old town overlooking the start-finish line on the left, and the river running along the right. When it comes to fictional places from these games that I'd most want to visit if they were real, Smoky Mountain North would almost certainly be at the top of that list. It's an excellent track with a great flow, but as a location, it's still yet to be surpassed. When it came to GT Sport's new original tracks, there was a clear intent to make them appear as more realistic, like they could easily be created in real life. I feel like Lake Maggiore is the most positive reflection of this mentality when it comes to track design. Set among the mountains of northern Italy, the visual appeal of this circuit is beyond doubt. But for me, the layout of this track is the real star. Not only is it a really fun course to drive, it has clearly been designed with racing in mind. There are high-speed corners, low-speed corners, long straights, dramatic elevation changes and camber. This track has pretty much everything you could possibly want. So, given my effusive praise, you're probably wondering why it isn't ranked any higher than 15th. This is really just down to my personal preference when it comes to original circuits. I have more of an affection for tracks that use the fact that they don't exist to really push the boat out and do some outlandish things, but Maggiore just wasn't designed like that. So, although if it did exist in real life, it would easily be one of the greatest tracks in the world, when it comes to Gran Turismo, it just doesn't quite break into that top echelon. Gotta love the many shorter variations though, those are awesome too. Grand Valley Speedway is viewed by many people to be the track of Gran Turismo, and it's not hard to see why. As one of the few originals to feature in each of the first 6 games, this was the longest circuit in GT1 and GT2. This always made it feel quite definitive, and being the host of the iconic Grand Valley 300km endurance event only added to its reputation. In terms of scenery, Grand Valley is styled as a proper international racetrack, with plenty of grandstands and other infrastructure. But it does also have a rural side, particularly from the second sector onwards, where the circuit cuts through the titular valley by way of 3 separate tunnels, and also over a lake across the now iconic Blue Bridge. As for its layout, this track is mostly comprised of open, flowing corners where throttle control is key. The first sector does feature some elevation changes as well. From GT4 onwards, the track was given a minor redesign to make it flow better, and it's this version which I prefer. An excellent circuit no matter what you're driving, Grand Valley Speedway will forever live long in the memory. Well, unless you work at Polyphony. Dragon Trail Seaside is my personal favourite of the, let's call them, current era original circuits. Its layout is pretty simple, essentially being a triangle with a hairpin at each end, punctuated by a couple of chicanes and the high-speed S's. This setup leads to a fast course with some technical sections, but it's the elevation changes that really tie the whole thing together. And it makes sense, given that the track is set in the foothills of a mountain range. Visually, this gives it a very distinct identity, as you have the mountains on one side and the coastline on the other. This track looks great, is fun to drive, and fun to race, but it's not without its controversy. On the run down to the final corner, you'll find a very high-speed bus stop chicane nicknamed the Chicane of Death. In the context of them trying to design more realistic circuits, it is pretty ridiculous, since there's no way that such a corner would get approved in real life. And since it can be taken flat in most cars, it kind of defeats the whole point of a chicane. But at the same time, it is extremely satisfying to get right. A real high-risk, high-reward corner. Although you could argue that it should be removed or replaced with a more conventional chicane, by this point it is firmly part of the identity of this great track. Another GT1 original, Trial Mountain is one of those circuits that's easy to drive in slower cars, but gets exponentially harder the faster you get. It essentially has its own skill curve, which is one of the things that makes it so appealing to come back to. The setting of the track is also something that makes it stand out, as you race directly between the bare rock faces. And much like Dragon Trail Seaside, the final chicane has always been the standout corner. In this case, not because of its potential to kill you, although that is still possible, but because of it being one of the easiest corner cuts in the entire series. I'm not really sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Oh, and just for the record, if this ranking were based solely on the GT7 redesign, where the track has been massively stretched out without adding anything new, beyond the squared-off final chicane, it would be ranked quite a bit lower. As it stands, it only slightly affects its ranking, since the older version is what most people still associate as Trial Mountain. Our final Alpine location is the Matterhorn complex of circuits. These are tracks where you really have to suspend your disbelief because there is no chance that something like this could exist in real life. And for me, that's what makes it so cool. They really went all out to create some of the most unique and challenging circuits they possibly could. The key word here is elevation, and being in a mountain range, what else would you expect? Steep inclines, declines, and even a couple of jumps. Pair this with layouts that have corners ranging from fiddly and technical, all the way to high-speed sweepers, and you end up with a real thrill ride of a drive. My personal favourite of the four layouts is Rottenboden, the track you're seeing right now, mostly because it encapsulates all of these different elements the best. Not to mention that it's also quite narrow, which makes this one of the toughest original circuits in the entire series. As much as I really love this track, I can't justify ranking it any higher given that, depending on how you use it, it can quickly devolve into chaos. But sometimes just a little bit of chaos can be a good thing. Alright, we finally made it to the top 10, and starting us off here is Midfield Raceway. This is a staple of the franchise that first appeared in GT2. This track is pretty widely loved in the GT community, and I think a big part of that is purely down to its layout. Despite being only just over 2 miles long, it manages to pack in a decent amount into that space, including the long front straight and many fast and flowing corners. Of course, the presence of a crossover between turns 5 and 6 allows it to be more compact, and also highlights the impressive elevation changes. On paper, the layout may look quite simple, but that's really the subtle brilliance of this track. Midfield was modified slightly over the course of the series, with its so far final appearance as DLC in GT6 being easily my favourite. It's here where this track finally managed to look as good as it is to drive. I've always said there are two types of people in this world, those who love Cape Ring and those who despise Cape Ring. So I decided to put it in my top 10 just to piss off that latter group. No, being serious, I really do enjoy this track. I think it's easily the best of the new original circuits from GT5. It fully embraces its identity as a fictional track and just runs with it. At the same time, this is likely why there are some who dislike it. Features like the spiral bridge and the big jump were always going to be divisive, and whilst I do admit that they are slightly over the top, they certainly don't make me hate the track. Far from it. And when looking past just those two specific things, I absolutely adore the rest of the layout. There's such a great flow, particularly around the start and end of the lap. The setting is also very unique, with a wide view of the surrounding area, heavily inspired by various places in Japan. Overall, the track is quite long, measuring almost 4.5 miles, but it can be split into 4 shorter variations. My personal favourite is the outer periphery course, which takes in Cape Ring's most noteworthy features, and also its best corners. When talking about the 4 original circuits that each appeared in the first 6 games in the series, I often find that Special Stage Route 5 is the most overlooked. and honestly, I'm not really sure why. This track is awesome. It's mostly comprised of fast corners, but there are a handful of slower ones as well. It's a good challenge, and its constant nighttime setting helps it to stand out amongst its peers. Its depiction in GT3 and 4, where there are various illuminated signs, and you can clearly see the flash from spectator cameras in the grandstands, is visually one of the most impressive parts of the PS2 era of Gran Turismo. In GT5, they tried to make it more realistic, particularly when it comes to the road layouts, but it just feels kind of unfinished. In some places, you can clearly see side roads that just end abruptly, and the lack of spectators makes the whole place feel dead. I call this Route 7 syndrome. Even still, I'm not counting that against Route 5 too much, as the general layout was still excellent. And of course, being a street circuit with no margin for error only ups the stakes. However, there is one major reason I know about of why it feels like this track often gets overshadowed. And that reason is this, Special Stage Route 11. Now I have to admit, if we're talking purely about which track has the better layouts, I think Route 5 is superior to Route 11. But what can't be denied is that Route 11 was the most challenging circuit in GT1, and one of the most challenging in the entire series. Being easily the most ignored of the GT1 OG circuits, only appearing in a single game after that has undoubtedly added to its mystique. However, when it did re-emerge for GT3, they went all out in the looks department. There are so many cool details here, like the big wheel, the building inside the tunnel, and the massive bridge that can be seen just beyond turns 1 and 2. And although the changes made to its layout from GT1, now bypassing the original Death Chicane, do make the track not as much of a challenge, the new section lined with illuminated trees is just stunning to look at. I also think the newer layout makes the track flow better and is generally better for racing. But whether it was in GT1 or GT3, Route 11 has forever been a technical marvel, and every lap of it always feels special. Costa di Amalfi is like a greatest hits selection of tarmac rally stages. It has slow hairpins, jumps, and even a pretty fast downhill section. But the key to its excellence is its setting, the island of Capri. This location was an inspired choice, and so was Polyphony's decision to then create a fictional layout based on the island's roads so they could truly maximize the idea. Here's a fun fact, even though these roads are fictional, the double hairpin at the end of the lap is based on a real place in Capri. In a universe where the notorious money exploit from GT4 never existed, I still think this track was always going to be well remembered. And even if the layout were crap, just the setting alone would be enough to make it stand out. But fortunately, the layout is also exceptional, so this track can be fully enjoyed regardless. Like so many of the special conditions courses from GT4, it's narrow and tricky, but being on tarmac gives the extra precision needed to prevent it from getting frustrating. Really, Amalfi is some of Polyphony's finest work. Circuito della Sierra did not end up so high on my list purely thanks to its length. Whilst it is easily the single longest original road circuit, it's what it does with that length which is so great. Over its near 17 miles, it's constantly throwing new and interesting challenges at the player, keeping them on their toes with every turn. It's essentially GT's very own Nürburgring, but even longer. Whilst it is predominantly high speed, there are a handful of tricky technical sections thrown in as well, and even a few parts where you can get some airtime. If you can master Sierra, you can master pretty much anywhere. On the side of visuals, I don't think there's much that I need to say, with the circuit being based on the beautiful Andalusia region of Spain. This means that the circuit is not only fun to drive fast, but also a real pleasure to just cruise around. Sierra is also the only circuit on this list to come with its own unique game mode, the Sierra Time Rally, and that has no doubt added to its memorability. I love it when the series tries new and interesting things with its tracks, and frankly, I'm not sure if Polyphony will make another circuit like this ever again. Something that I really value when it comes to track design is efficiency, what the developers are able to fit into a given space. And so, although these two tracks have nothing to do with each other on the surface, geographically or thematically, I really feel that El Capitan is like a shortened, condensed version of Circuito della Sierra. So much of this track, from its corners and elevation changes, make it feel like a strange predecessor of sorts. But the true excellence of El Capitan is in how it manages to pack in most of Sierra's best elements in just a fraction of the size. It is a real rollercoaster ride of a track, and once again, all in a picturesque setting. But of course, this track predates Sierra by quite a while, making it a truly unique circuit in the series when it appeared in GT4. Its abundance of steep inclines and declines results in a tricky layout that will take some time to get used to. In the higher end race cars, this track is seriously difficult, with a supreme handle on your throttle, braking and steering needed to prevent losing control in some sections. El Capitan has long been a fan favourite circuit, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Managing to break into my top 3 is the oh-so-forgotten Rome Night. One of the biggest enigmas when it comes to Gran Turismo, nobody fully understands why Rome Night was created and what purpose it was meant to serve. Its only definite appearance in GT2 is in a single license test, although it can appear at random in the event generator and one-make races. But although there are many unknowns when it comes to this track, including why it was set in Rome despite not being based on real roads, and there already being an actual Rome circuit in the game, there is one thing I can say for certain. I think this track is one of the best designs Polyphony ever came up with. I really love its mix of long sweeping corners and more acute turns. It culminates in a layout that is not only fun to drive and with a great flow, but is also excellent for racing. In terms of atmosphere, there isn't really a whole lot here, much like the PS3 version of Special Stage Route 5. But to be honest, given how underused this track is, I feel like it just adds to its mysterious, almost eerie vibe. It's just a shame that because of circumstances, not many people were able to truly discover what this track can offer. Now, this may come off as my deliberately rating it higher because of how overlooked it is, but I genuinely believe that if Rome Night had appeared in a much more prominent way, it would be heralded as one of the best original tracks in the series by more people. But even without doing the hundreds, if not thousands of laps that I've done at some of the other tracks on this list, I can still appreciate Rome Night as the legend it could have been in another life. And so we go from one of my lesser driven tracks to possibly my most. Like series producer Kazunori Yamauchi, Deep Forest Raceway has always been my personal favourite of the GT1 originals. It's just such a classic design, starting off with a relatively low speed infield before breaking out into a much faster second half of the lap. One thing I quite like is how the visuals of the track also match this dynamic. The slower infield takes place deep within the dense forest, whereas the latter half is much more open, both visually as well as in terms of the layout. Regardless, both sides of the track are made fun to drive thanks to the abundance of camber and elevation change on almost every turn. I also feel like this gives the track a very good balance. Since GT6, it's become my de facto test track for benchmarking cars. I love driving here in pretty much every game, but we once again can't ignore the GT7 redesign. Now, whilst I admit that the changes made to the ending of the lap do kind of spoil that dynamic I was talking about, I don't inherently dislike the changes in the same way as Trial Mountains. Now, don't get me wrong, I still prefer the old high-speed sweepers to close out the lap. But I'll just say that with or without the GT7 version being considered, Deep Forest was always going to be ranked second on my list. This track has a big place in my heart and has been the scene of some of my all-time favourite races, both in single-player and multiplayer. For me, Gran Turismo just wouldn't be the same without it. So then, which track is number 1? What could I have possibly ranked higher than Deep Forest? Well, let me just say it one more time. This is my list. It's not yours, it's not anyone else's, it's mine. And so, ranked number 1 on my list, we have Città d'Aria. Yes, I'm really putting that insanely narrow street circuit from GT4 at the very top. When it comes to original tracks in Gran Turismo, I don't think they come any more polarizing than this one. No other course is able to generate such mixed emotions in people, and that's kind of why I absolutely love it. For me, life is about entertainment, and there is nothing I find more entertaining in Gran Turismo than flying through the narrow streets of Assisi in GT4. This is possibly the only track on this list that I could drive on my own for hours on end and not get bored of. And of course, the main reason I find it so engaging is because of its difficulty. This is not only the most challenging circuit in Gran Turismo, but one of the most challenging in racing games, full stop. To achieve a perfect lap here is nigh on impossible, and that's one of the reasons why I always feel the urge to come back to it. It's brutally tough, yet not in an unfair way. But when it comes to actually racing on it, well, that's even more interesting. Being considered as a special conditions circuit means that it's restricted to 2-car battles. These are subject to the same issues that plague the other special conditions events in GT4, namely the combo of annoying AI and stupid penalty system. This is where a lot of the frustration around this circuit stems from, but when it works just right, and you're able to have a proper battle, it is some of the most intense racing you'll find in Gran Turismo. The key is to have patience in waiting for the right time to overtake, and precision when making the move. Being able to overtake cleanly around here is the mark of a truly great driver. In terms of the setting, the town of Assisi is an amazing place, and once again, nothing like any other track in this series. Its unique road layout allows for a really dynamic course, and one that's surprisingly high speed in places. I have to say that the downhill sequence of corners just before the back straight is maybe my favourite part of any circuit in Gran Turismo. I've talked a lot about what makes these tracks unique, how they stand out from one another, so I think it's really fitting that my number one is the most unique original track in Gran Turismo history. City d'Aria is a type of circuit that I'm fairly certain we will never see again in this franchise. Some would argue that's probably for the best, but there are others, like myself, who believe that, even if many people don't fully realize it, it was decisions like these that helped make Gran Turismo so great in the first place. So, what did you think? That was my ranking of every single original circuit in Gran Turismo to date. I just want everyone to remember that when it comes to something as subjective as track design, there really are no right or wrong answers. My list is based on what I value the most when it comes to these tracks, and that's something that can differ massively from person to person. So please, don't take these rankings as a definitive statement of fact, because my opinion is just as valid as anyone else's. Anyway, when it comes to circuit types, here's how they each stack up. As it's ranked number 1 overall, this means that City d'Aria is of course my highest ranked city track. Deep Forest in 2nd overall is the best ranked of the standard circuits, and also the best of the 8 OGs from GT1. My highest ranked dirt course is Smoky Mountain North in 16th overall, and for snow tracks it was Lake Louise in 51st place. The top oval in the list ended up being Broadbean in 63rd. I also have a handful of awards I'd like to go through. The first is for the track that produces the best racing. From my experience, I'm actually going to give this one to Dragon Trail Seaside, ranked 13th on my list. Its combination of long straights and tricky chicanes always throws up some fun and wild races. There really is never a dull moment around here. The next is for the most creative circuit design. I'm handing this one off to Red Rock Valley in 20th place for its fascinating double oval road course concept, something that I have never seen in any other racing game before or since. And the final award is for the most visually impressive track. For me, I don't think there's any contest. It has to be Special Stage Route 11, specifically the version from GT3. Even today, I still marvel at just how stunning they managed to make it look. So, now that I've created my personal ranking for these tracks, there's one thing that I've wanted to find out. That is, which of these games has, on average, my favourite selection of original circuits. To work this out, what I did was take each of the 8 mainline GT games and list all of the original tracks that appear in them, including DLC. Then, I added up my rankings for each and divided them by the total number of original tracks in said game to give me a final average ranking for each one. So, the final thing that I'd like to do in this video is share the results of this with you all. Bringing up the rear in 8th is Gran Turismo Sports with an average ranking of 39.12. In 7th is Gran Turismo 7 with 37.26 as of August 2024. 6th is Gran Turismo 4 with 33.04. Gran Turismo 5 is in 5th at 31.28. Then comes Gran Turismo 6 just slightly ahead on 30.78. Gran Turismo 2 is in 3rd with 29.50, Gran Turismo 3 has 25.53 to put it in 2nd, which means that the original Gran Turismo comes out on top with an average ranking of 24.37. Now, these results do have to be taken with a grain of salt, given that they're mean average scores, so kind of like we're taking all of the circuits in each game and combining them into one track and giving that a ranking. It also doesn't take into account the number of circuits, and that even if a track may not be that highly ranked, it can still be a positive through the variety it adds. For example, if you remove Test Course from GT1, that would massively improve its score, but it wouldn't make the game any better. Even still, there are some interesting trends we can notice. The most obvious being how the scores generally trend downwards as the series goes on, with GT Sport being ranked the lowest. This is a reflection on the circuits becoming more realistic. As I said, I have more affinity towards the unique and outlandish tracks that were more frequent in the older titles, so this makes sense. To further highlight this trend, GT1 is ranked the highest. 5 of its 8 circuits make the top 14 of my list, so I'm not too surprised. Of course, my personal attachment to these old tracks will always play a factor here, there's no denying that. But even still, I think they did an incredible job with those initial designs. There's no way they would have lasted so long in the series without major changes, unless they were just that damn good. And all in all, the other games come in roughly where I expect them. GT7 is just slightly ahead of GT Sport thanks to the returning tracks, and GT6 improves on GT5 with a couple of standouts. GT2 also ranks high thanks to its unique and creative circuits, and GT3 is mostly made up of fan favourites from the first 2 games, which explains why it comes in 2nd. The only real surprise for me is GT4 in 6th. I've always said that one of the best things about this game is its tracks. To prove this, 6 of my top 10 are in GT4, and 3 of those are even exclusive to it. But what drags its rating down are a couple of factors. 1, having Beginner Course, Test Course, and Ice Arena right near the bottom. This is somewhat understandable, but what compounds the issue is the number of street tracks and special condition courses also ranked in the bottom half of my list, like Seoul, George V Paris, Chamonix, etc. It goes to show that whilst GT4 had many excellent new additions with great variety, there were also some mediocre ones that we tend to forget about. And obviously, this is only considering original circuits. I'm sure if we included real ones as well, the story would be a bit different. The final thing I want to say is that, although I have been critical of many of these tracks, that's mostly because when it comes to original circuits in Gran Turismo, the bar is always set very high. I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't truly believe that these tracks were worth talking about. Most of the lowest ranked ones are mainly there down to their simplicity, but even at their worst, GT's original tracks are still better than those in most other racing games. With that said, thank you if you made it all the way through this video. It's been a long one. Let me know if there's anything else in Gran Turismo that you'd like to see me rank in the comments. But as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.